Evening, everyone. I'm Stuart Williams. I'm the publishing director at the Bodley Head, and I'm also Adam's editor for Emergency State. And it's great to be here tonight, thrilling to have reached publication day, and we're very happy to be here at Doughty Street Chambers. We're going to enjoy a conversation between Adam and Pippa shortly. As many of you know, Pippa's the political editor of The Guardian, formerly of The Mirror, where she was instrumental in breaking the story that became Partygate. Adam is a barrister here and a visiting professor of law at Goldsmiths, University of London. But just before they begin, Emergency State was submitted to us as a proposal in February, and then it was written by June, and it's published today, and it arrives absolutely laden with praise from all sorts of wonderful writers. And there are not a lot of books that we publish that quickly, but it's sort of typical. Adam's made everything about writing a first book look laughably straightforward. Even if he had a running start of sort of living and breathing the subject for 2 years before he put pen to paper, and doing important groundwork of challenging policemen in parks around London. But I've really loved the experience, Adam. It's been such a pleasure working together, and we're really proud to publish Emergency State and to see it acclaimed far and wide already. And as much as I spend half my time telling authors don't pay any attention to Amazon rankings, I've got to admit it is pleasing on publication day to see it motoring into the top 100 out of the several million books that are available, which is no mean feat. But you're also heartily encouraged to buy many copies from actual bookshops, and it's great to have the wonderful Primrose Hill bookshop here tonight. So if you haven't paid them a visit, do make the detour. But I think we're going to just crack on, and I'll leave it to Pippa and to Adam.
Remember to press the green button. So when Adam asked me to come and do an in-conversation with him about his book, I started thinking back to the start of the pandemic and where we all were. And much of my time was spent at Westminster, dashing in and out of Downing Street, where the Prime Minister and his scientists, chief scientist and chief medical advisor, gave a series of press conferences back in March 2020. And when things really kicked off, I was actually at home because I was suffering from a tight chest, a cough, a fever, and I thought, you know what, that sounds a bit like COVID. I'd better be careful, and took the decision to stay at home. So that press conference on the 23rd, I think it was, of March 2020, when Boris Johnson announced that restrictions would be coming in, that schools would be closing, a whole series of other laws, I was watching on my iPad at the kitchen table. And then 3 days later, on the 26th of March, the legislation came in, and that really was your starting point, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And it's just to say, it's so good to meet you in person,
Yes.
Pippa, because we've spoken so much over the past, 18 months on various things that we'll talk about. But as you know, it's very nice to be able to do something in person. And thanks to everyone for coming, family, friends, colleagues. It's really great to see you all. So on the 23rd of March, I don't remember where I was, but I remember watching and thinking, oh, wow, they're going to be locking us in our homes. What's the basis of that locking in our homes? And when the Prime Minister said, I'm giving you a very simple instruction, you must stay at home, and if you don't, the police will have powers to do something. What were those powers, and where was the law? And I asked around on Twitter, which is the only thing I had left because we weren't allowed to leave our homes, and nobody knew. And it became quite obvious at the beginning that this was going to be very, very messy. If you're going to tell people they have to stay at home, if you're going to force people not to work, tell people they can't go out to worship, to protest, to see their loved ones, you're going to have to come up with some laws pretty quickly. And in fact, it was 3 days later, on the 26th of March, that the law arrived. And I found out later, and I think it's now public knowledge, that the reason it took 3 days was because in the it was only a few days before the 23rd that the government decided they were going to do a lockdown. They were completely not contemplating that. They had no plan, there was no strategy in place as to what laws they would use, because there was no thought that they were going to use the laws. And it was only when they had this estimate from was it King's College, saying an unmitigated pandemic will lead to 500,000 deaths, which sounded almost unbelievable. Doesn't sound so unbelievable now, knowing what's happened. It was only then that they started planning, and then what that meant was it was only on the day of the 23rd that the civil servants were instructed, as far as I understand it, to start writing the laws. And then when they arrived, surprise, surprise, they were different to what the Prime Minister had said, and that began, the mess.
And something which really struck me at that time was, I think it was the day before the laws were announced, the 25th of March, Parliament rose and wasn't to return for a month. And yet we had these really dramatic changes to all of our lives, but no MPs there to debate them, to amend them even. I mean, you must have found that, as following the detail of it, that must have been pretty shocking to you as well.
Yeah, I think it was 6 weeks after the law came into force, which if you remember pandemic time was might as well have been 6 years that Parliament didn't get a sniff of these laws. And the reason why was because they were using emergency procedures that allowed them to bring laws into force without, when Matt Hancock signed the bottom of the piece of paper, that's when the law came into force. And so Parliament was excluded. And I think a lot of people probably would say, and something I say in the book, is at the beginning, when it was, you'll probably all remember, it was sort of panic stations for the whole world, not just for the UK. And you would expect there to be a bit of a mess and a bit of exceptions made. But what I chart in the book is that happened not just for those first 6 weeks, didn't happen for the first 6 months, it happened for the first 2 years of the pandemic, that Parliament was just left out of the equation.
Do you think that lack of scrutiny has had lasting damage?
Well, I think it's almost certainly damaged the laws themselves, because the laws themselves were increasingly bad laws. And I mean, they weren't. I'm not saying all of the laws were unjustified, and it wasn't justified to have certain restrictions, but they were not high quality laws. They were difficult to understand. They became more and more complicated, and then I think in the longer term, I think it got Parliament used to taking a back seat to what was going on, and I think that's the longer term damage. But I think there's lots of damage that has been done by the pandemic because of COVID. Not necessarily because of any particular response to it. It's just a pandemic damages a state, damages a society, physically, mentally, spiritually. But I think that's one element is the element I look at in the book.
And you mention in the book that over that 2-year period, there was over 100 emergency laws passed to restrict our lives, which averages one a week. Out of those, only 9 were debated in Parliament before they came into force, and not a single one was amended by MPs. Now, I remember in that first 5-6 weeks feeling really impotent as a journalist, because we had these press conferences, which then became a daily feature of all our lives. You turn on the telly at 5 o'clock and tune in, and sometimes we got the opportunity to ask questions. But we also had a sort of a huge amount of, most of the sort of feedback we were getting from readers was like, why didn't you ask this question, and why aren't you holding the government to account on that? And it was a really unusual situation, because we felt we were the ones that were having to sort of challenge the government in a way that normally Parliament would. There'd be committees, there'd be MPs, and they just weren't there. It was a really sort of strange time. But you touched on the emergency legislation, but of course ultimately the government ended up using the Public Health Act, but that wasn't sort of the original aim of the Public Health Act when it was first devised, was it? And how did maybe you could tell us a bit about how that was, how that ended up being used as a vehicle?
Yeah, well, the Public Health Act, the Public Health Control of Disease Act 1984, I'm sure you all know. Let's talk about the history of the Public Health Act, which really is very interesting. It started in the 19th century as a sort of sanitary reform. So it was about stopping things like cholera. But it was really about, clean water and that sort of thing. In the 1980s, it was changed. It was sort of it was modernised, and it was used. If any of you saw "It's a Sin," the TV series, you remember without any particular spoilers, there's a scene where there's a young man. So "It's a Sin" is about the beginning of the AIDS crisis in the early 1980s, and there's one of the protagonists in it at one point. So he is HIV positive and he's showing signs of AIDS. And he wakes up having collapsed in a hospital bed in Wales, in an empty ward, and he wakes up in this sort of quite scary looking place, and he shouts to the person at the door, said, "Can I go and see my parents?" And they say, "No, you can't leave. You are detained under the Public Health Act of 1984." And that story is based on a real event that happened at Monsall Hospital in Manchester. There was exactly that happened, and there was a big public campaign about this guy who was detained in the hospital, and there were protests outside, but that was basically what the Public Health Act could do. You could detain one person if they were suffering from a communicable disease. But then in 2008 there was a big change to it, and because of the SARS pandemic, SARS epidemic I think it was, there was the World Health Organization said to every member state, you've got to upgrade your public health laws to stop a future SARS pandemic, a pandemic like SARS. So we did that and basically turned this act into something that you could detain individuals with a magistrate approving it, to an act to give powers to ministers where you could do anything to people or things to prevent the spread of a infectious disease. And what that meant was, by the time we got to 2020, there was this power on the statute books that allowed ministers to, first of all, use these enormous powers, but second of all, do it without any parliamentary buy-in for 4 weeks, at least sometimes longer than 4 weeks, later, by which time, as you remember from the pandemic, it's irrelevant because we're on to the next crisis, the next outbreak, the next reduction or expansion. So that's where the Public Health Act became a sort of this power.
Now, you were joking about how your lockdown hobby was stopping police in parks and on the streets and testing them. Well, you were doing it. Your lockdown hobby was stopping police and testing them on
my children
their knowledge of the legislation, of the rules, and all of our experience, I'm sure, was that actually at best, often those in official positions had a pretty shaky understanding of what the law actually was. And obviously, over time, those laws got more and more complex. I mean, they started off with, 11 pages of regulations during the first lockdown, and then by the third lockdown, it was over 100 pages long. So the police were in an even more difficult position, and we all have heard stories about really sort of discrepancies in the application of that law. How much of a problem was that? What drove you to stop them and test them? And do you think that there was a way that we could avoid that happening again? Should we be in an unfortunate position again of having to rely on these sort of powers?
Well, I mean, through my work, I speak to police and I see police fairly regularly, and I'm not, worried about going and chatting to them. But the thing that I was interested in was what did they think they were doing when they were out? Because they were out. The police, to be fair to them, were given a completely new role. They might, they're used to stopping people, fighting or stealing, and suddenly they're trying to stop a disease spreading that nobody really knows very much about, and certainly they don't know very much about. And they're being given these new laws often twice a week. There will be a change to the law, and they are also people just like everybody else. They have families. They are, they can get ill themselves. They are worried about, what's going on as well. And I think that they were given an incredibly difficult task, as were police forces all around the world. And I asked police to contact me at one point. I think it was during the third lockdown in January 2021, just to say, you can message me. How are you feeling about what's happening? And I got an amazing amount of messages, and a lot of them saying, we're embarrassed by officious Northern Constabularies was one of the references, but it wasn't just Northern Constabularies. They were embarrassed. They were scared, they were worried that the trust, that the limited trust they have between the public and the police was being taken away, because they were having to basically go around, stopping people buying Easter eggs and or travelling to the countryside or visiting their sick relatives. These police did not join the police force to do any of those things. Unless they're really very strange people. But I think, look, I mean, they I think found it very difficult. I know a lot of them followed my Twitter feed, which is not a great sign. If they look, I mean, it's nice to know that people care, but it's not. You don't want necessarily the police to be doing that. But I think they found it very difficult to understand the laws. But I think the other interesting thing about public officials is what happened to the politicians and the public officials, the sort of central government public officials. And I guess that's where we start the story towards Partygate and how that will happen. But I think that the initial warning of that was Dominic Cummings in spring 2020. What do you remember about reporting that, and what was, how did that feel?
Also, this was during the first lockdown, and I got a phone call initially about 6 weeks before we published the story, which was at the end of May 2020, telling me that somebody had seen Dominic Cummings up in County Durham at a time when we were all supposed to be at home. And we had known that he'd been ill with COVID. We'd all seen, I don't know if you remember that, it became a bit of a meme afterwards, images of him running out of number 10 with the Dancing Queen music, because one of our sources told us that they'd spotted him in Durham standing next to his car. The radio was on, ABBA's Dancing Queen was on the radio. So I immediately thought to myself, well, this isn't right. Surely this is wrong. Surely this is a mistake. This can't be right. And my source was absolutely adamant. So we dispatched a photographer down there immediately. Didn't get there in time, which would have made the whole thing a lot easier actually if we'd had photographic evidence. Because of course we then had 6 weeks of trying to piecing together this really complicated jigsaw, all throughout faced with obfuscation, denial, and frankly lies from that number 10 operation, as they tried to sort of resist us publishing a story. And I was very conscious that because of everyone was making sacrifices at that time. For some people, like me, it was a fairly minimal sacrifice. It meant that I was at home, my children were at home, I have a house with a garden and the weather was nice. It wasn't sort of the end of the world. But like all of you, I also had people in my life for whom it was a huge sacrifice. Either they were, living in a small flat without any outdoor space and lots of kids. They were key workers who had to go out to work and potentially put themselves in, especially in the case of the NHS, but in other areas as well, in the face of danger in terms of infection. People suffering really sort of harrowing life experiences, like not being able to be with loved ones when they're seriously in hospital, dying, funerals. We've heard the stories. Visiting my mother-in-law was a care home throughout the pandemic. I didn't see her for 18 months. We all have like our personal tales from that time. So I really felt that everyone was making sacrifices, and yet here was somebody who had not just, wasn't just in government, but had been instrumental in drawing up those very rules, those very laws that we've been talking about, who apparently wasn't following them himself. So that was kind of the context to it, and we eventually, working with The Guardian, because I was at the Mirror at the time, we eventually got the story of the line and published. And
that was, I guess, one of the things that I speak about in the book about that incident is there was an interesting study from UCL who were monitoring behaviour and attitudes during the pandemic towards the lockdowns. And they said that the report that they published a few months later said that the Dominic Cummings moment, and when he gave the famous talk in the Rose Garden with a glass of water in front of him in his white shirt, that was a turning point for public trust in the government. And the phrase that I've quoted in the book is that it turned from "we are all in this together" to everyone for themselves, or everyone doing what they can get away with. Because there was a real, I've acted for a lot of dishonest people, unfortunately, in my career, and it's so obvious listening to him talk that it was like a school child trying to concoct a story of And he said recently, he said that I wasn't actually why at all that I went to Durham, to Barnard Castle, to Durham at all. It was because had security concerns. You know, just completely different stories. So, but I think, I mean, there's a personal, it's a sort of personality interest. He's an interesting personality, but it's so interesting to me that it wasn't an isolated incident.
You talked about inequalities in the book, and I remember getting a text from, it was actually a Labour advisor, when the story broke, texted me and said, one rule for them, one rule for everyone else. And that's kind of like the mantra that is sort of stuck throughout. And that's how people felt, isn't it? I mean, you write about inequalities in the book and how the inequalities in the application, but also in the perception of the rules.
Yeah, there was, I did a debate, which I wasn't on the side of the person who said it, but there was a sort of an anti-lockdown side, and someone said, I thought it was a great line, lockdown was when rich people stayed at home and the poor people delivered them stuff. And there's a truth to that, because I acted fairly recently for the family of an ambulance worker who died, in the first month of the pandemic, because they didn't really have the procedures, or they didn't have the procedures in place to protect him. They didn't know that COVID was spreading asymptomatically, or they said they didn't know. And it's the case that a lot of the people who were in real sort of public facing roles that were essential workers were essentially exposed to the virus in a way that other people weren't. But going back to Dominic Cummings, I think we then had Matt Hancock, didn't we?
Yes.
That was, I mean, it is amazing that of the architects of the lockdowns, which were Johnson, Matt Hancock, Dominic Cummings, all three of them had to resign or leave their post because they were caught breaking lockdown rules. And Hancock was,
It's all in the name of love.
Yeah, it was all. Well, that's what he said, wasn't it? It was all in the and he said, "Oh well, I may have broken the guidance." But I think he broke the law. I mean, it was quite obviously he broke the law, because you weren't. I mean, I had a whole. There was an article in Cosmopolitan about the sex ban, which was just crazy. But it was the case that if you weren't living with someone, or you weren't in a linked household or support bubble, you couldn't meet with someone and have an affair with them. You couldn't, go to a hotel with them or whatever they were doing. So I don't, he obviously broke the law, and it's just unbelievable. It was the health secretary. His name literally was at the bottom of all of the laws.
And it was the hypocrisy of it, wasn't it? Because for each of these cases, and there were other cases as well, it really wasn't that hard to look back as a journalist at probably one of the press conferences, but there were also interviews and other things that they did, public statements where they specifically warned people against hugging or kissing or sex or any of these things, and there he was, and unfortunately for him, there was the very striking image of him on the front page of the Sun, with his arms around his girlfriend.
There was another image at that time, not as striking, but I saw it in the newspaper. I was acting for the parents of Harry Dunn, the motorcyclist who died in Northampton, and there was a picture about April, May, in the news of Matt Hancock very closely shaking their hands, the parents' hands when he met them, and I just thought, well, how are they squaring this with? It was like when Boris Johnson went around shaking everybody's hand in the hospital. But so Partygate.
And they told us about it.
Yeah, and they told us about it. And it's sort of proud of it, but. One thing that I think is Dominic Cummings has said, and a few other people have said, is that Boris Johnson compared himself to the mayor in Jaws, who lets people go into the sea, despite everybody saying there's a threat of the shark. I think that's just extraordinary.
But it says a huge amount about his attitude, and he was proud of that. He was proud that he was a risk taker. I think the whole COVID experience for him, one of the things that really struck me was, if you remember, he was very ill at the end of March 2020 and ended up in hospital. And I really struggled with the thought that somebody could have gone through COVID themselves, and to such an extent that they needed oxygen support and their families were worried about whether they'd even live, and to come out the other side and still sort of shrug a bit at the laws, and constantly throughout. And I'm not suggesting for a minute we can believe everything that Dominic Cummings writes in his blogs, but he is not alone to report that at every turn, Boris Johnson was kind of, his instinct was to fight against any controls, not with the obvious concerns that you've mentioned in your book, but further than that, just sort of, it was almost like he wanted to be contrary and not to be contrarian and do things his own way, and even when he knew that potentially it would result in tens of thousands of deaths, later on, hundreds of thousands of deaths, later on in the pandemic, not even in that first sort of period that you could possibly say, well, look, did anybody know what they were doing? Did any government know what they were doing? But it's sort of the second lockdown and so on.
Yeah, well, I mean, I call it, the chapter in the book is the darkest winter, and that's 60,000 people died between, I think, November and the end of January 2020 to 2021. And that's when there was the argument of whether we'd have the circuit breaker lockdown for 2 weeks. It ended up being, I think there was basically 5 months of, more than 5 months of very, very severe restrictions. What would have happened if that had happened earlier? But that Christmas was also the party Christmas, or the beginning of the party Christmas. So how did it all begin?
So in stark contrast to the first lockdown, where I think most people other than Dominic Cummings in Number 10 had stuck to the rules, recognised the severity of the situation they were facing. I think by the time they got to the second, what would be the third lockdown, but that winter that you talk about, attitudes had changed. And I first heard in the January of 2021 that there'd been social gatherings, or a social gathering, as it was first told to me, in Number 10 involving the Prime Minister. And I tried really hard to get, it was kind of like third hand, so I tried to get closer and closer to the initial source, because a story like that, clearly you can't run unless you have a very high threshold. I have very high thresholds of proof, multiple sources. And I've said subsequently that I first heard about it then, and a few people have sort of suggested on Twitter, well, yeah, it's a conspiracy, you hid it, you didn't report it. It's like, oh no, my God, if I could have reported it, then I really would have done. But, as is often the case in journalism, you get this little nugget of information that when I realised I wasn't going to be able to get the story anywhere near over the line, anywhere near publication, I stored that little nugget of information away in my head and thought, well, a time might come again where it proves relevant. And then lo and behold, in October last year, a contact got in touch and said, I've got something I want to show you. And I described it as a metaphorical brown paper envelope because it sounds a bit like Watergate-ish. It wasn't actually a brown paper envelope, but it was a piece of evidence that persuaded me that it was worth looking at this story, this issue again, knowing what I'd known the previous, the months before. And so I doubled down on it. I went back to the contacts I'd made and spoken to about it initially. I went to more people. I went over dates. I went back to initial people. I cross-checked. It's actually a really boring, diligent piece of work. You just have to go through everything again and again and again.
It's like my work. It's good. It's good. It sounds good at the end, but it's pretty boring when you're doing it.
And then, but built up a picture that I was absolutely convinced was an accurate one. Knew a lot more than we published in that first story. We published that there'd been a Christmas party at Downing Street, that there'd been a social gathering on November the 13th in Downing Street that involved the Prime Minister's flat, and quotes from various sources in Number 10 suggesting that this was just the tip of the iceberg, that there was more. They were always at it. I think one quote was, "Carrie's addicted to a party." And anyway, we ran that day. It was a Wednesday morning, so Keir Starmer brought it up in Prime Minister's Question Time.
So this is about November 2021.
That was the 1st of December, so we published on the last day of November and the 1st of December, sort of throwing back to that time. And then the story took off, and of course we then were in touch, because as this story developed, more people, I had the original allegations which I was working on, and it kind of is, you publish one story and people come to you with other tips, and then I also met and spoke to other sources, and we did a series of, probably like a dozen different stories over the course of the following months. I think one very powerful thing I should mention was the video of Allegra Stratton, which Paul Brand from ITV published a couple of weeks after our initial story, because I think there's something about the visual imagery of seeing people joking about the stories that we'd revealed that obviously really struck a lot of people.
And it was just at the very moment where there was a question about whether Christmas would go ahead that year. That was the sort of visceral. Well, that's what turbocharged it.
That was right, but that was actually behind so we had this 6 weeks before we published, and I remember sitting in the briefing room, it's actually number 9 Downing Street, in the briefing room, and Jenny Harris had been on, the UKHSA chief, had been on the radio that morning. And if you think about it, that summer, COVID had kind of dropped off the front pages and wasn't sort of leading the bulletins. Normal life-ish had resumed, and then the Omicron variant arose in South Africa, and suddenly it started becoming newsworthy again. You know, are we going to have another wave of the pandemic? It was on the front pages, it was in the headlines, and Jenny Harris came on the radio that morning on the Today programme and was asked specifically about Christmas parties and socialising and whether people should go ahead. Obviously, everyone was kind of casting their mind back to the year before, where they were thinking Christmas was cancelled and my plans were all scuppered and I wasn't able to be with my loved ones. Don't want that to happen again. And she said, well, she thought it'd be a good idea to make choices. So, you know, yes, see your loved ones, but don't necessarily go to a packed room with lots of people dancing late into the night or whatever. So we then asked the Prime Minister's official spokesman, with all that context, Christmas, Omicron and Jenny Harris, whether Christmas parties should go ahead. And he basically, to use journalese, slapped her down and said, yes, they should. And that was sort of the government's position for some time in December 2021. But for me, it was kind of like, it was a light bulb moment. It's like, well, we've got this story. These are the different elements. People care about this again, and now's the time to publish. So it was like the final push just in those last few hours to get it over the line, and then, of course, we published the next day.
Yeah, and at that point, my spreadsheet came, the spreadsheet that I thought was, you know, was dead, basically. What's the point? We weren't going to have more COVID rules, but all of a sudden, and I'd been keeping this spreadsheet because nobody else, there was no other way of finding out what laws applied when. As strange as that sounds, that was the madness of the pandemic, that you had 100 laws and quite literally no way of finding out unless you went to my spreadsheet. And so every time Pippa had a lead or a news photograph or something, she'd text and we'd speak, and there would be a kind of I would consult the spreadsheet and try and figure out exactly what law applied at that particular time. And sometimes it wasn't that everything went ahead. So sometimes I'd say, no, that, you know, as odd as it sounds, that was completely fine, because at the time you could do X, Y, and Z, even though it's counterintuitive, but it's the case. And it was only the stories where there was clearly a legal problem for the people involved that were published. And there was, you know, and also I think most of the times that there was a story, I would write a little sort of opinion piece next to it in the Mirror, talking about the legality of it.
But that was so important from that very first story onwards, because it wasn't just about the hypocrisy. It had to be, in order to sort of have the public interest, the justification for running these stories, we had to be able to say what law was at the time, and to be able to have not just your spreadsheet, but your sort of, you know, expert commentary, if you like, explaining to people, because it was fiendishly complicated, exactly what regulation or law had been broken at any given time. It wasn't just useful to me and other journalists, but politicians were citing Adam in the House of Commons all the time, because, you know, they were able to say, look, Prime Minister, you know, this is the law that you've broken, and it was, you know, it's all down to that spreadsheet. So
yeah, but
you played a key role in it all.
Well, but it's just so odd to have that situation. I mean, it's because, you know, usually laws are easy to follow or relative. At least you can go to any lawyer and they'll say, I'll just, you know, check on the spreadsheet or check on the database what the law was. But it wasn't the case. But also the laws were difficult to understand as it was. And then I suppose things moved on and we got to the police investigation. And Jolyon Bourne's in the room, but there's an interesting story just about that. But the police said initially, we aren't going to investigate because we'll leave it to the government to investigate. And they were leaving it to Simon Case, the civil servant, the head civil servant who was investigating. And all of a sudden, Simon Case had a Christmas party, and you know you couldn't make it up. He was the investigator, and he had a Christmas party. And so the Good Law Project instructed me and Danny Friedman, Casey, who's not here, but we wrote a letter to the police. Said, "Are you serious? I mean, in summary, are you serious? Are you really not going to investigate? You know, what looks like a really serious sort of criminal enterprise in the middle of government?" And the police said, yes, we are serious, and here are our decisions. And the decisions that we saw looked really, really shaky. And in actual fact, there was, and Jamie's sitting there as well, there was a policy. There was a policy that the Met had that had never been published. And one of the reasons we knew about the policy was because they'd mentioned it, but also it came up in the Reclaim These Streets case that we were fighting at the time. And it was called the Prominent Person Policy, I think. It was a policy just for people who were at the centre of lawmaking, effectively. And God knows why it was written. My best guess is it was written after Dominic Cummings, just in case they would have to investigate law breaking at the heart of government. And in the end, they did. But it took a judicial review that we issued in court to get them to change their mind, although they would say it was because of Sue Gray.
Yes, and that was very striking when it got to the point of both the criminal investigation and the fines being issued, fixed penalty notices being issued, including, of course, the Prime Minister. And we've been through the weeds on why he was issued fines for some and not others, and how he may or may have got out of some which he probably should have received fines for. But I always remember when the Sue Gray report was finally, the full Sue Gray report was finally published. And it was kind of like one of these moments that you don't realise how much kind of stress you've built up in here until I read sort of every line that she had reported, and literally every single cough and spit of what we'd published was in there as fact. And when you've been faced with more obfuscation and denial, but when you've been faced with people not just sort of privately number 10 people saying this didn't happen or the Prime Minister wasn't involved, but also all his allies going off and sort of making jokes about being ambushed by cake and it was only a beer and it was only champagne or whatever. It was never about a piece of cake or a piece of champagne or a drink of champagne for me. It was always about the fact that these people had drawn up these laws which they weren't prepared to, which all of us followed, but they weren't prepared to abide by themselves. And at its heart, it was that kind of like fundamental hypocrisy. And for me, Sue Gray was kind of like I guess the thing that really put it to bed for me, and was kind of like, she's corroborated everything. We were all waiting for Sue Gray. We waited for Sue Gray, and she vindicated, I think, really, all our investigations.
And the police outcome as well. The police gave fixed penalty notices. They gave 126 fixed penalty notices about every single gathering that we were saying were unlawful throughout those sort of 6 months. And with a lot of, with anything with politics, you get a lot of very hard pushback, and sort of it becomes very personal. But I guess that's what that was sort of vindication, the Sue Gray and the police, and then eventually, one of the things I say at the end of the book is, yes, what happened during the pandemic to our state and to democracy, there was some very negative things, but in the end, there was accountability, because as I was finishing the book, literally as I was finishing the book, I cannot say how literally, because I was watching the Prime Minister resign, or I was watching the Prime Minister leave, the moment I was about to send off the final draft, and that is meaningful because it shows that eventually there is comeuppance in democracies, and you cannot keep something under the rug forever.
Well, I hope that's the case.
Maybe that's a bit optimistic.
But keep going. We've all seen the political fallout. You mention it, but I guess I just wanted to ask you about the legal fallout of it all, ultimately, and whether you think that your profession, but perhaps more crucially, the lawmakers themselves, have what they've learned from this, and what going forward, life has gone back to normal, more or less, post-COVID, but has the law kind of ever?
Well, I think one thing that's really interesting that hasn't been spoken about very much is the judges, and what I think of as where were the courts. Someone tweeted me the other day that in France, the French Constitutional Court struck down 50 COVID laws during the pandemic, and that happened in lots of countries. In Spain, the entire state of emergency was annulled. And they had to pay back every fine, 1 million fines they'd given out in the first 3 months. And our courts didn't strike down a single regulation. They were not interested. And in the book, there's a lot in the book about the Second World War, because I think there's an extremely interesting analogy between the emergency lawmaking in the Second World War. And there's a very famous case called Liversidge versus Anderson, which is very famous when you're a law student and for lawyers. And in it, it was about a businessman who was detained without trial under emergency laws by the Home Secretary because he was seen as a threat to national security. And he sued the Home Secretary, and the Home Secretary came to court and said, "Judges, just trust me, he's a threat to national security." And the judges said, "That's fine, because it's an emergency, and we're going to take it on trust." And there's a very famous dissenting judgment by Lord Atkin, who's one judge, who said, I'll get it wrong, slightly wrong, but he says, even amongst the guns of war, the laws are not silent, something to that effect. And he says that they are the judges are acting in a way which is even more executive-minded than the executive. And having been in court a lot during the pandemic in relation to these laws, I think there was an element of the judges saw this as not a matter for them. These were not matters. These were very important, very urgent emergency laws that were not for. They were for Parliament and they were for the government. But the problem was that the Parliament wasn't engaged, so it was really just the government, and it was really only four guys in the government. It was Hancock, Rishi Sunak, Boris Johnson, and Michael Gove, who were the four in the cabinet committee that was making the laws. And I think there's an argument that the courts, the courts let the side down as well in a way because they didn't stand up. Others will disagree with that, but I think it's worrying to me that during a pandemic you can have basically no pushback at all, no real pushback against even extreme laws. I think now might be a time to open up to questions, if that's all right. We've got about 10 minutes for questions. I think we've got a roving mic somewhere. Does anyone have a question? Or a comment pretending to be a question? Whoever you want.
You talk about the parties in Downing Street, and I declare an obvious interest. You say that the law breaking was serious. I'm not sure that it was in and of itself. And there's one point which you haven't mentioned, which I think is fundamental, especially as we're in a barrister's chambers, and that's the rule of law. The reason why the law breaking was important wasn't because it was serious. By that stage, the pandemic was actually fairly under control. It was a limited number of people. They were working together in any event. The reason why I think it was serious is because it's fundamental in the rule of law that the people who govern also have to obey the law. And it wasn't so much what they did, it was who was doing it and the excuses given for the behaviour. So, I mean, I'd invite you to comment on that, because for me, certainly, the rule of law issue was an absolutely critical issue, which got lost at that point during the pandemic.
Yeah, and the reason David cites an interest, because he was the first minister to resign because of Partygate, and wrote a very, very...
Not because he was involved in them, you should...
No, sorry, yeah, no. Not because, as far as we know, he wasn't... I don't think he was a minister at the time.
You're not in my little book.
No, he was never invited. He's too boring. No, it was. It was. I totally agree. I think if you can gauge the seriousness of law breaking by the level of penalty that is given by the state, a £60 fine or fixed penalty notice suggests it's not seen as extremely serious. But you're absolutely right. What it was about the rule of law, which means the rule of law, put simply, is that the people who make the laws have to comply with the laws. But I think the second part of it, which isn't a legal part, was politics, is the denials and the not facing up. And there were other illegal gatherings, probably illegal gatherings, such as I think the Department of Work and Pensions or the Transport had a
DFE as well.
DFE had a Christmas gathering. And at the very beginning of the Partygate scandal, they put their hands up. The minister put their hands up, said, "Fair cop, we're really sorry. We shouldn't have done it. It was a bad idea." And it does make you question, if that had happened across government, if Boris Johnson had gone to Parliament and said, not what he said, which is, "I didn't realise, I shouldn't have done it. Now I realise," that sort of mealy-mouthed stuff that he said. If he just said, we put our hands up, we did the wrong thing, and we're really sorry. Maybe none of it would happen. Maybe David wouldn't have had to resign. Maybe it would have been, it would have all been fine. But it's
It wasn't in his character to do that, though.
No.
And I mean, that was my point about it was never about the cake or the parties. It was about the fact that these people that wrote the laws then and expected us to follow them didn't themselves. And actually, all the sort of convoluted responses that Boris Johnson came out with over the course of several months has now led to, of course, this parliamentary inquiry, which hasn't even begun yet. So I'm sure that we'll be raking over some old ground. You might even be asked to go and give evidence. You never know your luck. So it's that part of the story, if you like, isn't even over yet.
yeah.
Thank you very much. Conor Gearty, LSE. I want to just push you on a point, Adam. You mentioned the Second World War. Well, the Defence of the Realm regulations in the First War permeated the legal culture for decades after and were integrated via ordinary law in all that we did. I would like you to tell me a little bit, I just don't know, about the long-term impact of and the corrosive effect of the regulations that you described so well in your book. Is it a one-off, or is it something with which we live in terms of administrative discretion, broad rejection of rule of law? How serious are the long-term effects?
It's absolutely right. I mean, the Second World War laws stayed in place for decades afterwards. Some of them. I mean, I think that a lot of property, so much property was requisitioned. A lot of it was not given back. There was a huge amount. There was rationing, all of that. So I think there is an element. It's very different in that sense. It was a different kind of crisis, and we don't have COVID laws now. As in, we don't have any COVID law. We don't, apart from the Coronavirus Act, which I suppose is still in some ways operating in minimal ways. The regulations themselves aren't in force. But I think that the longer term impact, as I think you were suggesting, Conor, is that once a culture develops of a certain kind of way of doing things, through ministers just sort of stepping in. I think there's an element of it with the energy bills. Maybe people disagree with this, but this idea that the government will just come in and sort stuff out, and we'll do it, on the nod. Effectively, we'll just sort stuff out. I think there's a pressure now on ministers to do that, and I think there will be a concurrent inclination for ministers to look for the quickest and easiest and least disruptive to their agenda way of doing things. So I think there's an element of that. I think that was happening before coronavirus, and it's happening after. And I think there is also the risk of another crisis. We do have crises all the time. The last big one, which is sort of equivalent, was the war on terror, in the early 2000s and throughout the 2000s, where lots of emergency laws were brought in and have never been repealed. Suppose they were emergency laws, but they're still around, and we've kind of normalised things, like mass surveillance, for example. We sort of normalise it. It becomes a thing, and then it's there for good. And I think in the longer term we'll find out what the longer term impacts of COVID and the things I talk about are. It's not easy to say exactly now, but it will be more than minimal. I'm sure of that.
So our court case with Reclaim These Streets was happening really at the height of Partygate. Without the public outrage and pressure from Partygate, do you think it would have gone the same way?
With the legal decision, yes, I do. I think that the outcome of that case was in the stars. I think because just I think the way a lot of cases don't go like that, and it just went all the right ways. It was the right team, it was the right judges, it was the right clients, it was the right cause, it was the right moment in all of those ways. I think I noticed a lot quite in the pandemic when I was in court for example, the hotel quarantine case that I did, that was in the High Court right in the middle of the Omicron outbreak. It was you really felt different to be in court during a proper outbreak of COVID, where there's a sort of almost like visceral feeling that if the judge thinking, if I strike down this law, then I could be the cause of, thousands of deaths, because which might not be true, but I think there is that feeling. But I think because the Sarah Everard Vigil case, the Reclaim These Streets case, was looking backwards, it wasn't looking forwards. It wasn't. There was no there's no need for the judge to strike anything down. There was no future effect, apart from more generally in protest law. I think that made it. It all just went right. It didn't feel like it at the time, but these things only go right and look like they were destined to happen in retrospect. But so I can't speak for those judges, and what they were thinking. They would say, well, nothing makes any difference apart from what the right answer is, which we all know is nonsense. But no, I think it was in the stars, actually, that particular case.
My question is a hypothetical one. Hi. If another pandemic were to occur and a government came to you from somewhere in the world looking for advice on how not to mess it up as royally as this government did in COVID-19, what would your key takeaways be from looking at this so carefully for 2.5 years?
Just a quick question. That's a great question. Well, I mean, I can talk about the UK, and I think that one of the things that it's a personal view of mine anyway, but I think the lack of a written constitution in this country really makes it harder when you have emergencies and emergency laws and states of emergency. Really makes it harder to navigate, because nobody really knows what the boundaries are. Can we ban the right to protest? Like, can we stop people worshipping? Can we stop people hugging? Like, what's the answer? You can look at human rights law, but whose responsibility is it? Is it the government? Is it the courts? Is it Parliament? And I think that the rules of the game at least are set down in a written constitution. They have their own problems. They can be, lots of reasons. Politicised judges, they can be too hard to change. All of that. But I think that is a problem for this country in those emergencies. It relies a lot on trust. And if you have a leader who's not very trustworthy, it can be a problem. It can be one of the problems. I think that also if there is another pandemic in living memory, the governments will be a lot better prepared for it, and they will understand. And they would, like with the Eastern countries which had been through SARS, they just knew what to do from day one. They knew roughly what to do with contact tracing and maths and all of that. Whereas we were, not having had a pandemic for 100 years, a real pandemic, we had no living memory, had no cultural memory of what to do. And I think things will change for that reason. There's other stuff in the book which you can, we should get to the end with, on what to propose. Any other questions? I think we can do one more question. We'll come in.
There are some questions on Zoom as well.
On Zoom. Well, should we just get? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Adam, Aoife Nolan, University of Nottingham and Doughty Street, and it's a very simple question. What next?
For me?
For you.
Well, can we ask Pippa that question?
Well,
no,
Pippa, I would love to hear from you
Pippa.
as well, but I suspect I might have a better idea. But Adam, it'd be lovely to hear about you, whether you've other writing plans or...
Well, I just today started work as a commissioner on the Emergency Laws Commission, which the Bingham Centre are running. So looking into emergency lawmaking. And it's a year project, which will be very interesting sort of development of those ideas. Aside from that, day job. Pippa, you've got a new beat?
I've just started a new day job. I mean, I took over at The Guardian 6 weeks ago, and it feels like 6 months. I mean, so much has changed, not least our Prime Minister. So they're definitely keeping me busy. My one fear when I moved jobs was that news would slow down, and it doesn't look like that's likely to be the case. So I think you guys are all as plugged into what's going on as I am, and it's going to be It's going to be a busy and interesting time, should we say?
As we were organising this event, every time I wanted to speak to Pippa, well, first of all, the Prime Minister resigned. There was a new Prime Minister, and then the Queen died. We thought there would be a quiet week, then the Queen died. And now it's just a sort of perpetual
Economic crisis.
crisis mode. But I suppose that's just that's the job.
Yeah.
Have we got a question from Zoom?
Yes, I can put the questions on the screen so you'll be able to
Oh, wow.
everyone.
There they are.
Oh, the last one. Which country came close to getting the right?
Which country came close to getting the pandemic? That's actually, to answer Aoife's question, I'd quite like to do, if I do another edition of this book, I'd really like to do a chunk on international comparisons, because, and there's some really good research out there and data, and there's sort of Jeff King, is it UCL Kings? UCL? UCL has done, he's got a fantastic sort of COVID collection of comparators of all different countries, and there's all sorts of really good comparative stuff out there. I've looked a bit at this. I mean, interestingly, if you just look in the United Kingdom, Scotland, I think, did a much better job in terms of scrutiny and involving the Scottish Parliament than the Westminster Parliament did. And that just goes to show, you know, it was really the same outbreak in Scotland as it was in everywhere else. You know, the UK is not that big that you could really distinguish between the different parts of the UK for very long. But I think Scotland did a much better job. I mean, one of the interesting things I haven't spoken about, but very early in the pandemic, I was appointed as a specialist advisor to the Joint Committee on Human Rights, which COVID inquiry. They were looking at the COVID laws through a human rights perspective. I did that for about a year, and Eleanor Horrigan, who's the counsel to the Joint Committee on Human Rights, and I had informal meetings throughout the pandemic from the beginning with two people who have been appointed as the independent commissioners for the police, the COVID response of the police. One in Scotland, who was John Scott, KC, and one in Northern Ireland, who was John Wadden. And we used to meet on Zoom and just sort of have these informal meetings. And one of the what was so interesting about that was that Scotland and Northern Ireland had these official mechanisms to understand what the police were doing right, doing wrong, and they were producing reports. And England had nothing like that. And I think that just demonstrates, we were sort of goggling, these meetings were just increasingly what on earth is going on kind of meetings, which I guess was a lot of people's experience of the pandemic. But I think that the other parts of the UK, you know, which I think also have a better human rights culture than England does, particularly Northern Ireland and Scotland, they were doing things better. Just, you know, at the same time, we just weren't. I don't know. We dropped the ball in certain respects. Was there any? And I think the other question has been. Was there one other question? Zoha, do you want to just wait for the microphone, just so people online can hear you? I think this will be the last question, then you can have some food and drink.
So I was just going to ask, you mentioned that all of the three people that were key in writing like the COVID laws had scandals surrounding them and breaking the laws. But during the period there was also like other scandals, not just like COVID, like Owen Paterson or Chris Pincher, for instance. Why do you think there were so many scandals like in such close succession around this time?
That's such a good question. I think Pippa's actually, as the politics expert, I think it's a good question for Pippa.
So lots of people make comparisons to John Major's time and his part as Prime Minister, and how the Tories were sort of beset by scandal in the sort of declining years of that administration. And I think some of those comparisons are valid. I think when a party has been in power for a long time, I think a sort of degree of complacency kicks in. People take more risks. And I think a sense of entitlement actually also hits in. And I think particularly with the Owen Paterson case, And people talk about, Tory MPs talk about Partygate, Patterson and Pincher being the three Ps that ultimately did for Boris Johnson. I would say I think Boris Johnson did for Boris Johnson, but there is a sort of a pattern that emerges there in terms of sense of complacency and entitlement and protecting your friends and thinking there's one set of rules for you and one set of rules for other people, which in my mind is part of a sort of a declining administration. Maybe I would say that, but I think that is a valid observation of the last 18 months, and certainly looks set to continue for the time being. So I don't think it's unique to the Conservatives. Maybe it'd be the same if another party had been in for a long period, but I think it's certainly a factor when one party is entrenched in power, as this one has been for so long.
Bring on Keir Starmer. That's all I say. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening and asking interesting questions. Thank you very much to Pippa. We've got you a little gift.
Is it cake?
It's books.
Oh, amazing.
Thank you.